Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 22nd of May, 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Garish. Well, I think we should say to our audience, brace yourselves.
Well, before we do that, I'll just apologise to anybody who's trying to get onto this programme via the UK Column website. Literally, again, for the second time in a week, the website has gone down. It's been attacked 5 minutes before the programme was due to start. Purely a coincidence, I'm sure, but nonetheless, that's the situation. So apologise to our members who are trying to access the chat box. Hopefully you're watching on YouTube or Facebook. Now, yes, brace yourselves, because the rather reptilian-looking Tony Blair was on Radio 4 this morning on the Today programme. You'll understand why I call him reptilian-looking as we go through the programme, because we'll come back onto that subject a little bit later. But he is concerned about Brexit. Now, I have to say this is the third time, Brian, in 3 months, 2 months maybe, that the BBC has had Tony Blair on to push forward his pro-EU line. But this time, I regret to say that I have to say that I generally agree with the main point he was trying to make, right? And I choke almost in saying that, but let's understand what he's saying. He's saying for the Labour Party, the position is even more stark. As was entirely predictable and predicted, we now find ourselves in the worst of both worlds. That, of course, is harking back to David Cameron's best of both worlds document, or at least tipping his hat to it. He goes on to say the Labour Party position is also contradictory. If the reason for being against the European free trade area or the single market is that we don't want to be merely rule takers, then the customs union solution has the same objection. We will be taking the trade rules that Europe negotiates. The Remainers, however, have now cottoned on to the fact that Labour is not really for remaining either, except in the very limited sense of the customs union, and so unsurprisingly they're losing faith in Labour as a route to avoid Brexit. The Labour Party will pay a heavy price for the leadership's closet Euroscepticism. Now, of course, there's nothing terribly closet about Jeremy Corbyn's Euroscepticism. The rest of the Labour Party, well, that's another question. But what Blair was going on to say, the bit of where I strongly depart from his position, was that, of course, while the government is creating this mess over Brexit, at the end we're going to have another referendum to agree the final deal. But he's right in saying that Theresa May's position here is untenable in the sense that if people have an objection to the free trade area, the single market, then they have the same objection to the customs union. And this debate within the cabinet of one type of customs union compared to another is just ridiculous. Anybody that believed that Theresa May was ever going to bring us out of the European Union was off their heads. But it gets better, because Nick Clegg was talking today as well, and he says that Brexiters, people who support Brexit, have forfeited their right to be heard. This is a pretty democratic position, I would have thought. What do you think?
Well, I think it's quite normal for Clegg.
Yes.
Liberal, but
yeah,
only for the correct policy.
Yes. They have forfeited the right to be heard on the process. They advocated Brexit during the referendum without the faintest idea what it means in practice. They still can't agree amongst themselves how it should work, and they have no remote chance of crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's before the deadline, which they themselves established. So he's now calling for a further 12 months to be added. He's calling on MPs to move to lift the sword of Damocles, as he calls it, which presently hangs over the timing of the Article 50 negotiations. When faced with so many doubts, so many loose ends, so many unresolved questions, the first and simplest thing to do is to give the country that most precious of commodities more time. And as you see on screen, he said what this country is experiencing with all the risks and threats it poses is nothing short of political and constitutional crisis. And again, I completely agree with him. Absolutely, that is what's going on. But let's not forget that this is a deliberately engineered political and constitutional crisis, and that's the key point. So these guys are all in it together. Blair, Clegg, and the current Tory leadership, all in it together, is our argument, my argument at the very least. If we want an idea, as I've said many times before, of where the Tory government is going with this, we do need to go back to David Cameron's Best of Both Worlds document and have a look there for some of the answers.
Yeah, so Westminster, simply a puppet show while all this goes on in the background. What's constantly in my mind, Mike, is how would this country be getting on if we were just focused on running this country, if we were focused on what we need for industry, jobs, how we're going to run the NHS, how we're going to repair the roads, how we're going to look after people who are homeless. If we were focused on these things within the United Kingdom, we would be doing fine. But what do we see day after day, hour after hour? This constant nebulous debate over the European Union and Brexit and the delay, the shambles. What is it doing? It's dragging this country down. And the Tories said with Danny Kruger and Nick Bowles that they were going to introduce a period of creative destruction. That's what we're witnessing. Did notice that Mr. Clegg is looking not too well in that photograph, Mike. I don't know whether it was a recent one, but perhaps our viewers might like to freeze that screen and actually have a look and see what I'm looking at. But I think he looks decidedly peaky, as if he hasn't been treating himself very well. But I'll leave you to interpret that one.
Yes, let's move on to Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy Hunt says that he is going to host the first ever global ministerial mental health summit in London this October. And when I read that the first time,
you smiled.
I did, yes, because I couldn't think of a group of people more appropriate to be, featured in a mental health summit than the current British ministers of state. But in fact, this summit will aim, he says, to help countries work together to increase the evidence for different treatments to deal with mental health issues and to ensure healthcare systems around the world value mental health as much as physical health. But my point here is that yet again we see a health secretary who's looking at dealing with symptoms rather than the causes of the problems. If there are mental health issues arising within the public, what is the causes of those? What do you think are the causes of them? Could it be a combination of modern technology, being bombarded with rubbish in social media, stress of having to listen to the likes of Jeremy Hunt talk and read what is appearing in the mainstream media?
Well, that's part of it, Mike. I say it's deliberate to reduce the health of the nation to chaos, much the same as all the rest of it. And of course, we're going back to policy that we saw around, for example, Colonel Rees Rawlings in the 1940s, where they were talking about introducing mental health into this country as a particular political tool. And here it is running. I think we'll cover more on that in the coming weeks. Well, let's have a look at some of the, the happy people. I just couldn't resist this one. The Guardian, and it says that Michael Gove and Ruth Davidson are forming a team and they're backing a new Tory think tank, which is called Onward. So here are their happy faces. Gives you a lot of confidence, don't you, that people like this are running the country. And they're supporting Onwards. And we need Onward because otherwise the Tory party is going to be finished within a generation. So let's get into this. So we'll bring the lovely lady on the screen again. And the top caption there is from the Express. This is where she was originally setting out the Scots Tory vision. And this was all looking promising for Scotland. But now she's warning that sometimes as Tories we look a bit dour. She said, we look a bit joyless, a bit authoritarian sometimes. We don't get to win if we start hectoring the people we need to vote for us. When you do it with a smile, they actually get behind you. So this is where we've got to now. She's looking pretty dour in that picture, I would have thought. But of course, they think that if they smile, we'll be carried along with the authoritarian bit.
Excellent.
Is this a mental health problem, Mike? Possibly. Well, I'm just going to remind people that Michael Gove stood on a public stage in London and said that he was proud to be a Zionist and a friend of Israel. And my question, which I'm very happy to keep asking, is which comes first, the UK or Zionism? It would be nice to know this so that we know what the true objectives of our politicians are. but we don't know. But there's the question, which comes first? And if we just follow this gentleman through, this is jumping back to local Eastleigh election, where the Lib Dems and UKIP beat Tories into third. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, said it's a disappointing result for the Conservative Party, but it's clear that in mid-term by-elections, people want to register a protest. But he said he was confident that at the general election, we can win these people back by demonstrating that we're delivering for everyone who wants to work hard and wants to get on. I'm going to have to laugh while I'm saying this because it's so ridiculous. And that's what we want to be focused on. So we didn't do too well, or he didn't do too well in the elections, but really it was Michael Gove that I wanted to bring in because he said he was gutted by the result, which he described as a protest vote, partly driven by a distaste for elites. So he does understand what the problem is, an authoritarian elite that people actually dislike. And it isn't going to make much difference whether you look dour or you smile. These people are living in their own reality, Mike,
Absolutely.
and perhaps they should have a word with the health secretary and see if they could get a slot. So we'll pop him back on screen smiling, because in that article he said the Conservative Party is at its best when it appeals beyond its core vote and puts forward a reforming, forward-looking agenda that responds to the concerns of the entire nation. So that's all pretty good. And I'm just going to ram it home by saying, well, if you look at the record, what they're interested in is war. So here was the headline from The Guardian, where it was pointing out that William Hague was telling the cabinet, don't talk about the war because it's embarrassing and it shows the public what we're really up to. But on that note, and I'm sorry for this image, that it is disturbing, but I have been greatly encouraged by the amount of media being posted on government Twitter pages where people are pointing out what's really going on in the world.
So Brian, what is the point of this think tank then?
Well, it's going to help the Tories refocus on where they should be going.
So is this some kind of attempt to counter the sort of Labour progressive movement?
Well, one of the things that was pointed out was that membership at the moment of the Tory party is about 125,000 compared to 500,000 for Labour. So I think there's a bit of unrest at the moment. They realise that Theresa May is in fact some form of walking dead zombie. How are they going to counter this? Well, we need a think tank, and they've put a smiling dour Scot in with Michael Gove in order to come up with good ideas.
Good stuff. Okay, well, here's some better ideas. So yesterday, Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary, was saying that the UK needs to be at the forefront of space technology, that that it's essential we protect our interests and assets from potential adversaries who seek to cause major disruption and do us harm. So he said that it wasn't just a crucial tool for our armed forces, this is space technology we're talking about, but vital to our way of life, whether that be access to our mobile phones, the internet or television. And so he's going to boost the number of personnel working in the defence space sector by a fifth over 5 years to more than 600, with the RAF Air Command taking on responsibility for command and control. So that was yesterday. Today, he's setting up an artificial intelligence lab, and this is going to be hosted at Porton Down, apparently. Yes, the launch of a new artificial intelligence hub to be hosted as he hosted the first ever joint US-UK Defence Innovation Board meeting yesterday. And as part of the MOD's commitment to pursue and deliver future capabilities, the Defence Secretary announced the launch of AI Lab, a single flagship for artificial intelligence, machine learning and data science in defence based at DSTL in Porton Down. AI Lab will enhance and accelerate the UK's world-class capability in the application of AI-related technologies to defence and security challenges. I have to say, if it's that good, perhaps we should replace him with a Russian bot or something.
Perhaps he already is, Mike.
Well,
this is the trouble.
My suspicion.
So, yes, isn't it interesting that the siting of this lab is to be at Porton Down?
Isn't it? Yes. DSTL, of course, is an executive agency of the Ministry of Defence run along commercial lines. It's one of the principal government organisations dedicated to security and technology in the defence and security field, with 6 sites at Portsdown West, Fortman, and so on. But anyway, the point is that's where it's going to be hosted. Just a coincidence.
Just a coincidence. Okay. Well, we're following through a theme here, really, which wasn't planned, but it's quite encouraging to see how it's coming together. So let's bring in the UK National Security Advisor, Mark Sedwill. We got a bit of information this morning that he's been tweeting various things out. So we got more to come on that. But I just followed through on this one because this is one of the things that he'd retweeted. The UK is leading the response to the Syria crisis, providing life-saving help to millions of Syrians, supporting first responders, providing emergency trauma care and specialist equipment to respond to attacks. So this is all pretty lovey-dovey stuff. What was encouraging was the public response to this. So we can have a look at some of these. This one was a little cartoon. It starts off with the Free Syrian Army. It goes up through al-Nusra to ISIS to the White Helmets. And this is the progression. It says, bombing Syria and supporting the White Helmets is not in the interests of the people of Syria. So this is really starting to give us a very good insight into why the government and its agencies is so frightened of social media. So this is the next one. The UK government is responsible, along with America and France, for everything that's wrong in Syria. To have the audacity to post this shows your contempt for the people of Syria and Britain. So some really, really excellent stuff here. What's this one? It says £10 in aid, 100 billion in arms and weapon sales, not to mention materials for the manufacture of chemical weapons. Then, of course, the British overseas territories launder billions of dollars. So people really thinking about what they're being told and they don't like it and they're saying so. UK needs to intervene in Syria but continues to fund the murder of Yemenis. Might this concern financial gain and not whatever moral obligation line we're being force-fed? So even when the opinion is a little bit broader, the message is still the same. Let's do this one here. This is from a gentleman called Kevin Quinton. The hashtag white helmets are not hashtag first responders. They are the hashtag propaganda arm of the Syrian opposition. And this one was pretty simple. It had a photograph of President Assad being surrounded by a crowd and shaking hands. Whenever this was taken, this was not a man worried about being assassinated by his own people, Mike, is
Indeed.
it? And the caption says, most Syrians support their president and military, but the BBC presents Britons with a different one-sided story, etc. So it says at the top, leave Syria to the Syrians. So I was very encouraged by this, Mike. We're certainly seeing it on other government Twitter pages. Theresa May's just one of them. People are getting in there and putting their comments forward, and clearly this is beginning to spread. So is this the reason they want to try and shut down social media?
Absolutely, but the news gets better and better, Brian, because apparently for one site at least in Salisbury, the cleanup is now complete following the alleged poisoning of the Skripals. Decontamination work at the malting site in Salisbury is complete. This follows ongoing cleanup operations to remove any potential residual contamination following the nerve agent attack on the 4th of March 2018. This site was apparently visited by specialist teams, and any items that may have harboured residual amounts of the agent were all removed. All waste has been removed and will be disposed of safely. And a spokesperson from DEFRA, that's the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, said following extensive clean-up operations in Salisbury to remove any potential residual contamination resulting from the nerve agent attack on 4th of March, decontamination work is now complete at the maltings. The site will now be handed back to Wiltshire Council, who will decide when it is appropriate to release it back to public use.
Oh, how convenient. So the local councils just want a development site.
Yes, fantastic. So there you go. But the question remains, where are the Skripals? So I think this needs to be a hashtag. We need to be asking it regularly. We have seen no evidence of their existence. Are they alive? Are they dead? Are they in the UK? Are they in the United States? Where are they? Let's get a statement from them to let everybody know that they're safe and well.
And to hear their side of the story would be a good one.
Yes.
We're going to jump back to this subject, which was of Miss Ratcliffe, who'd been charged with spreading propaganda on top of her spying charges in Iran. And what we were saying was that she had connections with BBC Media Action, and of course BBC Media Action has got a track record of going into countries and essentially helping to undermine the government, or at least working with, other people who are trying to do that very same thing. So we'd highlighted these articles, BBC Media Action, subversion from broadcasting house to Kazakhstan. And we'd also talked about Julia Harkin, who, when she was working as a project manager for BBC Media Action, boasted of their work to work with the Syrian opposition to help undermine and remove President Assad. So many people will call this subversion. I'm going to ask again, was Miss Ratcliffe, was she duped into this dangerous BBC propaganda? Did she really know what she was getting involved with, or has she been duped by the BBC? I think this is a fair question. We can say because she worked for the BBC, she must have known what she was doing. But did the BBC give her a briefing before going into, I'll call it, enemy territory, as happened with spies during the Second World War? Or was she simply briefed as to her role and then let loose? And of course, the BBC totally abandoned her now, from what we can see.
I think if we look at this in the context of that freedom of information question I asked, where they simply could not apparently tell me what their organisational structure was for a particular department, who was working in it.
Yeah.
Then you got to ask: do members of staff know who the people in the next corridor are?
And if you don't know who you're working for, do you know what the policy is coming through? Well,
Absolutely.
Of course you don't. Now, the connecting piece for this was the Marshall Plan for the Mind, and I'm going to say a big thank you to one of our viewers who sent us through an email pointing this article out. So we're looking here at the New York Times. I'm sorry, I should have a date for you on here, but I think this is the very early 90s. It says the New York Times, the article's from the 90s, but the page that's shown is even earlier. Ideas and trends after the Cold War, different times, different stations. And the text says, not since World War II have the listeners from the British Broadcasting Corporation's overseas monitoring service been so busy. They're outpost in a former boys' school in rural Caversham, west of London. They work in relays before banks of dials and scanners, tuning into the growing babble of faraway radio voices that fill the ether, bringing news of ferment and democratic rebellion in the Ukraine and Uzbekistan and Georgia. Over the last 4 decades, the BBC, along with the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, helped pry apart the first cracks in the Iron Curtain, their scratchy shortwave broadcast piercing the noise and static from jamming transmitters across the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And if we look at this other piece of text, it goes on to say the BBC is about to add a new Ukrainian language service and wants to begin an Uzbek service as well. And it recently launched a television news network to compete with the cable news network, Tunes and Teaching. So isn't it remarkable that we had all the trouble recently in Ukraine? The BBC, of course, had been in there helping to stir the pot. And then it goes on to say the BBC are juggling programming schedules, adding more music and instruction in the English language. John Tuzer, the general manager of the BBC, now talks about what he calls a Marshall Plan of the Mind, which would use radio to bring instructional broadcasts in history, banking, accounting and communication to the emerging democracies of Europe. So somebody else picking up that what is the BBC pushing? Banking and accounting. This is This is helping the international banking cartel create revolution to make money, is it?
So BBC Media Action, definitely a successor to this then?
Absolutely. It's just retitled it and called it a charity so they can get even deeper. And thank you very much to this one that was sent through to us. This is Hansard, 23rd of May, 1994. And there's a discussion going on about the Marshall Plan for the mind. I'll bring in the key bit here. An MP, Mr. Barnes, said this: why is this crude capitalist propaganda being pushed out in the Russian media with the help of the government know-how funds, and why does it have charitable status? Why does not the programme show what life is really like in free market Britain, with 5 million unemployed, a third of our children living in poverty, 500,000 people on housing lists, and 500,000 building workers out of work? Well, as to be expected, in came a Tory, Mr. Bottomley. Has not that question at least provided my right honourable friend with the opportunity to share with the House the true facts about the Marshall Plan of the Mind? Would not it be a good thing if World Service Television and the Marshall Plan of the Mind were as successful as World Service on radio? We need more. Should not we continue to demonstrate the benefits of flexible economics and politics and of dedication to self-improvement, which in many ways has allowed this country to lead the world in broadcasting, publishing, and spreading many of our technical skills? So there we are. We can see the government pushing not only the BBC propaganda, but believing its own rhetoric that it's doing a good job for this country. I think more appointments with the health minister might.
Absolutely. But let's come on to this then, because this was being pushed out this morning. Conspiracy theories in Russian media. Nice little infographic here. Here are some of them. A network of historians conspire against Russia. A secret world government controls everything. HIV and AIDS is a myth. The world is controlled by reptilians. A gay lobby destroys Russia's moral foundations, and the world is flat. These are some of the 6 out of the top 10 conspiracy theories which are apparently doing the rounds in Russian media. Now the question is, where has this nice little infographic come from? Well, it's come from this organisation, EU versus Disinfo. EU versus Disinfo. They've got a fantastic website. I suggest everybody goes and looks at it. And in this article, Everyone Against Russia, Conspiracy Theories on the Rise in Russian Media, they say there's been significant increase in the appearance of conspiracy theories in Russia over the past 7 years. A new study shows that references in Russian media to a select group of popular conspiracy theories are on average 6 to 9 times more frequent now than they were in 2011. Disinformation is among the factors experts name as the reason for this increase. So apparently, not quite clear exactly what they're suggesting here. They're suggesting Putin is now pushing disinformation into the minds of the Russian people as well as the minds of the West.
whole world.
The whole world, apparently, yes, all coming from Putin, mind you. So aside from the 6 that I mentioned, the other 2 that were of note on this list were genetically modified food is dangerous and that's been kept a secret, and that vaccinations are extremely dangerous and that's been kept a secret. But as I say, reptilians absolutely on that list. Which is why I mentioned that with Tony Blair at the beginning. But who is this lot? That was my question. So let's have a look and see. EU versus Disinformation campaign. This website is part of a campaign to better forecast, address and respond to pro-Kremlin disinformation. The EU versus Disinformation campaign is run by the European External Action Service East Stratcom Task Force. The team was set up after the EU heads of state and government stressed the need to challenge Russia's ongoing disinformation campaigns in March 2015. We and our partners produced the weekly Disinformation Review, through which we have identified and compiled on our database over 3,800 disinformation cases since September 2015. And they go on to say, however, that apart from this publicly available output, we brief and train EU institutions, member state governments, journalists and researchers on this topic and participate regularly in conferences to share our experiences. Our products are regularly quoted and used by politicians, governments, state agencies, researchers, think tanks and journalists across Europe and beyond. So what we have here, Brian, is the most massive propaganda organisation and setup. We'll come on to more of this in a second. So let's have a look at the East Stratcom Task Force. There's what they say. How is the team composed? Have a look at this. There's a whole bunch of frequently asked questions on this page. If you search for it, search for questions and answers about the East Stratcom Task Force. But one of the questions was, how is the team composed? Of course, the team is anonymous. We don't get to know who they are.
Well, yeah, they probably follow the BBC line that because they're BBC, because they're East Stratcom Task Force, that is their credentials and we should trust them.
We should just trust them. Well, what they say is the team is made up of 14 full-time staff recruited from the EU institutions or seconded from EU member states. Team members have a variety of professional communications backgrounds and speak several languages, including Russian. And what's interesting is that the East Stratcom Task Force web pages all have a Russian version of them. So this is clearly meant to be pumped into Russia as well. But the question is Britain involved in this in any way? Well, indeed we are, because if we look at some of the conferences that this organisation takes part in, here's one as an example: Disinformation, the Playbook on How to Fight It, 2018 Brussels Disinfo Lab. And we discover that, Andy Price, who's the relatively new Foreign and Commonwealth Office head of counter-disinformation, is taking part.
Right, so the Foreign and Commonwealth Office tied in with BBC monitoring. We can say BBC Media Action is also tied in with this level of government for its grants.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's have another look at another sort of conference on this issue. And there he is again. So he's propping up in all these things. Now, this is the Andy Price that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office doesn't want to discuss in any way, shape or form at the moment. He's been quoted, the earliest quote that I can find from him in this professional role as head of counter-disinformation was from September 2017. So I haven't been able to find anything older than that involving Andy Price. But at this point in time, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office does not want to tell anybody what size of team he's got, how many people are working with him, what kind of budget he has, any of this kind of information.
Where they're based. Well, perhaps he's at Porton as well.
Well, we don't know. We don't know. And the Foreign Office doesn't want to tell anybody. So
I think we could ask our audience today, can you assist with any details about this gentleman and the work he is doing? We're always interested here from people in the establishment, of course.
Yes. Okay, Media on Trial taking place on Sunday, 27th, this coming Sunday. Not very many tickets left now. If you want to get a ticket, there are still a few left. Please get on the website, mediaontrial.uk, and get hold of one. I understand from Sheila and the other organisers that there will be an email going out to ticket holders tomorrow, which will describe the process by which details of the venue will be communicated. So please keep an eye on your email mailbox and make sure that you check your spam folder just in case that message should go in there.
And can we just reiterate here? This is the United Kingdom. This is Britain in 2018 with the Conservatives in power. Theresa May is the British Prime Minister. And in order to have a public discussion on the performance of the media, the venue has got to be booked and allocated in secret. People have got to turn up at secret venues in order to find out where that public meeting is going to be held. I'm old enough to say that this was the type of thing that we would see in the Soviet Union or East Germany. We've now got exactly the same system operating in UK. So this is real. If you dare to criticise the British media in 2018, you are going to be targeted, you are going to have the venue taken away from you, you're going to be accused of inciting hatred or whatever it is. Quite remarkable, Mike, that this is the situation. And if you're listening from overseas, we couldn't give you a better example of the fact that Britain, under Theresa May's Conservative government, is on a knife edge to a dictatorship. There's no question of it. And let's bring in this on a positive note, but a letter from Peter Hofstra, to say thank you very much to all the help and the fundraising that's been given. Now, remember, this man has been taken off the streets in Britain. He's been transported to Austria. He's been falsely sectioned and put in a mental institution in order to silence him. And it's only due to the generosity and attention of UK column viewers that he's now got a hope of getting out. So I've just put out there an excerpt of the content, but he says, can you please pass on our thanks, he's talking about his mother as well, to the people who stepped in to raise money. Mum would ask me, why are they doing this to us? What have we ever done to them? And he says how difficult it is to try and explain to an 80-year-old with some memory loss why she's suffering in the way she is. But he says what slowly became clear over the years is that our case was far from isolated. There are tens of thousands, and we would certainly support that statistic. There are tens of thousands of these cases, and let's not forget that Melanie Shaw, child abuse survivor, a whistleblower, in prison now for 2 years, most of which has been in solitary confinement. She's been put there by British Prime Minister Theresa May as former Home Secretary. We are now wondering whether Melanie is on an indeterminate sentence. Those are supposed to be banned, but we are now getting more concerned that Melanie is on an indeterminate sentence, and therefore she has no actual release date. A lot of work to be done on this case, but again, what a reflection of Britain in 2018. And we'll bring in the Russians here because it's taken Russia today to hit the nail on the head. US approves $45 million sale of 3,200 bombs and bunker busters to Bahrain. And what the article says is, of course, the British public are not going to be told the true details of the horror of those bombs and their use because that'll be censored.
Well, we missed this one, but a couple of days ago, Bernard Lewis passed away at the age of 101. And Peter Oborne here, writing in Middle East Eye, saying, do not weep for Bernard Lewis, High Priest of War in the Middle East. It's customary to speak well of the dead, he says. I refuse to observe this convention in the case of Bernard Lewis, a historian of Islam and the Middle East who died over the weekend, aged 101. I can think of no modern scholar who has perpetrated half as much harm. Lewis was intellectually a towering figure. This meant he had the ability to do great good. Instead, he became the intellectual high priest for the calamitous wars that have caused such bloodshed across the Middle East, while doing unlimited damage to the standing of the United States. He later deceitfully claimed that he had been against the Iraq invasion. This is rubbish. He was directly involved. Even before 9/11, he had pressed for regime change in Iraq. It was him and not Samuel Huntington, he says, who coined the phrase clash of civilizations. We're facing a mood and a movement far transcending the level of issues and policies and the governments that pursued them, observed Lewis in 1990, adding, there is no less than a clash of civilizations, the perhaps irrational but surely historic reaction to an ancient rival against our Judeo-Christian heritage, our secular present, and the worldwide expansion of both. And Oborne says that Lewis was also guilty of disastrous intellectual reductionism. To put it mildly, the world's estimated 1.8 billion Muslims do not all think the same. Lewis often wrote as if they did. Not that you know this from reading today's newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, the Times, the Daily Telegraph, and many other outlets carrying long obituaries full of praise for one of the sages of our great age. Now, of course, it wasn't just clash of civilizations policy that Bernard Lewis sort of invented. It was taken up by Samuel Huntington in the famous article in Foreign Policy magazine and then the subsequent book. But he was also the architect of Brzezinski's Arc of Crisis policy. And of course, this was pushing forward Muslim Brotherhood, fundamentalist insurrections all along the southern borders of the what was then the Soviet Union. And that policy was called the Bernard Lewis Plan for many years. Yes, I'm afraid I fall on Peter Oborne's side with regard to Bernard Lewis, and I'm not too sorry to see him go. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the way it is.
Well, that's fair enough.
Yes.
One quote.
One quote, yes, of course. Most of the states of the Middle East are of recent and artificial construction and are vulnerable to Lebanonization. This is how he was describing it. This was in a Foreign Affairs article that he wrote, forecasting the Lebanonization of the entire region. And he said most of the states of the Middle East, as I say, are of recent and artificial construction and are vulnerable to such process. If the central power is sufficiently weakened, there's no real civil society to hold the polity together, no real sense of common national identity or overriding allegiance of the nation state. The state then disintegrates, as happened in Lebanon, into a chaos of squabbling, feuding, fighting sects, tribes, regions and parties. And of course, this didn't all come out of Western policy, since it was Western policy that drew the borders in the first place, and it's Western policy that's fomented the splits and the divisions ever since. And
I'm going to say the same policy has been unleashed in UK, Mike, but we can talk about that in future programmes. Let's just remind people that UK Column did a lot of work to put on a conference to do with the NHS, Dying for Good Health. This was in Nottingham on the 12th of May. We had really excellent speakers, people brave enough to speak out, even from within the NHS. We had a remarkable coincidence that the very same day, the very same location, Nottingham, there was another NHS conference set up. We can now show you a little detail of that other conference.
We should stress that conference, of course, was set up after we announced ours.
Indeed, yes.
Hello, it's Jonathan Ashworth here, the Shadow Health Secretary, and can I send my apologies that I can't be with you today because of the important trade union march in London. But can I say I'm absolutely delighted that the Socialist Health Association is establishing a branch in Nottingham. Hopefully Leicester will be next, where I'm the Member of Parliament. And can I thank the Socialist Health Association for all the work that you have done in the Labour Party and the Labour movement over many, many years.
So just remarkable. We set up a conference because of the great concern about what's happening to the NHS. We book a venue in Nottingham, and then a short time afterwards, that conference is set up and advertised. And coincidence, Mike?
Well, what I find remarkable is it seems to be the Labour movement, which didn't or wanted to be counteracting the work that was being done by because remember this was a UK Column promoted event, but it was really there to facilitate a number of excellent campaigners on issues of NHS privatisation and other issues.
Yeah. So it was inclusive. Our conference was completely inclusive.
And so it's a real surprise that people that are notionally campaigning on behalf of the NHS would want to undermine that.
Yes, and of course we'll remind people that also we know that certain individuals from Open Democracy also took it upon themselves to send out some communications to try and warn off the speakers from speaking at the UK Column event. So just amazing that when you start to tell the truth about what's happening in the NHS, there's a move to shut you down, just as there is if you start telling the truth about what's happening in the media. Very quickly, with an eye on the clock, we just remind people this was one of the cartoons from our conference, cartoons used to illustrate some very dark points, but what the speaker was warning about was an increase in death rates, particularly amongst elderly people within the NHS system. And he said these people are being killed off so the state can steal their homes. So I found it very interesting that we've got the Mail today revealed how old bones are being recycled to make brand new hips. And apparently a project at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland is buying up discarded human hip joints from a local hospital and harvesting from them stem cells to grow new bone and cartilage in the laboratory. This is not new. This has been going on for years, but it's now broken surface. And of course, those bones are worth money.
Right, so these are discarded human hip joints that maybe people have gone in for a hip replacement, is that it?
Yes,
Or is it that people's body parts are being harvested?
I believe it's the body parts, Mike. That's my personal opinion. We're going to be dealing more on this subject. So whilst we've got serious things in the NHS, I did have to smile at this one. a Herald, Plymouth Herald article. It says Plymouth is getting a coffee academy where baristas will train. So this is Plymouth that in its heyday had about 50,000 people working in the dockyard alone, building ships, much industry dotted around Plymouth. We've now got to the situation where you can train to be a barista. No disrespect to the company concerned. I've no doubt that the coffee company concerned believe they're trying to do the right thing. But of course, this highlights the balance in jobs and training across UK. We'll leave it there. That's it. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you again to all the people who supported the Peter Hofstra campaign. If you have not donated and feel you still can, that any further money will be put to good use because, of course, Barbara Hofstra, the mother, is still effectively imprisoned in the UK care system. And the aim is to see whether we can get this lady back into her own accommodation. So much work to be done. And of course, I'll say exactly the same for Melanie Shaw. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.